Welcome to History 4314, American History Through Film. And today we're going to look at the sexual revolution in the movies, and then we're going to fight the Vietnam War in Hollywood. So let's begin with the sexual revolution in Hollywood, which truly begins in the year 1957. And the way we're going to introduce this topic is to look at a smut peddler, a name that you don't often hear these days, named Samuel Roth, because it was the man Samuel Roth who would irretrievably change America's laws regarding censorship. Samuel Roth was accused of selling obscene magazines and sending them through the mails. And he would be found guilty of doing this, and he would be sent to prison. But the precedents set in that case would alter America's definition of obscenity. And so while Samuel Roth would languish in prison, this case would open the door to sexually explicit magazines, books, and films. What the Supreme Court declared in 1957 was that the works that Roth sold were utterly without socially redeeming value. But the court went further, and the High Court stated that the portrayal of sex in art, literature, and scientific works was entitled to constitutional protections of free speech. The test that the court said needed to be applied in cases of obscenity was this, quote, whether to an average person applying contemporary community standards, the dominant theme of the material as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. Okay, let's try to decipher that statement. This is still the basic yardstick for testing obscenity today. Okay, a work must be utterly without socially redeeming value. That is, it was no longer possible to ban an entire work on the basis of a single paragraph or a single scene. It must be utterly offensive. Now, the impact of the Roth cases cannot be minimized. During the late 1950s, the major obscenity cases involved films like Lady Chatterley's Lover, which you could show on TV without being cut one bit, because it contains no nudity and it contains no four-letter words. That film was banned not because it was obscene in and of itself, but because it simply appeared to advocate, or at least it didn't condemn, adultery. Now, today, a case like that seems incredibly quaint when all one has to do is watch a sitcom that's spicier than the film Lady Chatterley's Lover. In the early 1960s, the major obscenity cases involved brief glimpses of female breasts or buttocks or non-erotic nudity in nudist camp movies. These were not films designed to titillate. These were meant to be sort of educational films. And these are what initially prompted controversy. Other controversies arose over the use of the word rape and the word contraceptive in the film Anatomy of a Murder. By the late 1960s, tests of obscenity are becoming more closer to what we're familiar with now. The controversies involved simulated sexual acts, such as a prostitute about to have intercourse with a dog. None of these acts would be considered hardcore pornography today. Nudity, advocacy of immorality, four-letter words, simulated sexual acts, all these are permitted by the courts and cannot be banned as obscene. It was in the mid-1970s that the courts began to hear cases involving hardcore content. For example, actual intercourse between a woman and a dog in a film called The Animal Lover, or the portrayal of 7 acts of cunnilingus and 4 acts of fellatio in the film Deep Throat. Now, in the absence of a classification system in the late 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court empowered local communities to establish their own system of classification. And at that point, Hollywood once again set up its own rating system. Hollywood has always believed that self-censorship is preferable to government censorship. And so in 1968, Hollywood responded by creating the rating system that we still have essentially today. It empowered the production board to label movies suggested for mature audiences. Under the system, which you're all familiar with, producers must submit their films to the Motion Picture Association's Code and Rating Office. The office views each film and assigns one of 4 designations. Now, the specific criteria on which these ratings are based is not public information. But it does seem clear that erotic content, far more than violence, is the most important factor taken into account. Today, I guess R no longer stands for restricted. Rather, it seems to stand for raunchy. Okay. Now we're going to turn to Vietnam in film. The Vietnam War was the single most traumatic episode in all of American history. It divided the country as no previous event ever had. It tore apart the Democratic political party. It brought violence to the nation's college campuses. It also brought violence to the nation's inner cities. Above all, the Vietnam War challenged America's self-image. As a country, we had never lost a war. As a country, we were convinced that we had always acted on the side of what is moral and good and just. But as I suggested, the Vietnam War seemed to pose a fundamental challenge to those beliefs. First of all, the Vietnam War would raise the specter of defeat. On one side, you would have people say that American soldiers had had to fight the war with one arm tied behind their back. Still others would say that American forces had been stabbed in the back by both politicians and civilians who had not stood behind them. And on the other hand, you had other Americans marching in the streets who condemned America's prosecution of the war as immoral. This issue of morality would also plague all later discussions of the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, the United States would use jellied gasoline called napalm. It would use saturation bombing, dropping more bombs than were dropped in World War II. It would make use of defoliants that turned out to be cancer-causing. The United States engaged in an assassination campaign called Operation Phoenix, which resulted in the killing of approximately 20,000 Viet Cong or North Vietnamese supporters. And finally, there was the crucial question of Vietnam veterans. What had the war done to them? How had the war changed the men who fought it? Far from being portrayed as heroes, Hollywood often portrayed Vietnam vets as misfits, as ticking time bombs, as maladjusted, and as psychotic. Now we're going to take a look at a brief clip from one of the early films that dealt with the Vietnam vet. It's a film that many of you are probably familiar with. It's called Taxi Driver. It's from 1976. And in this film, the great actor Robert De Niro plays Travis Bickle. He is a man who is portrayed as unhinged from the Vietnam War. Let's take a brief look at this clip. He's driving down the streets of New York.
All the animals come out at night. Whores, skunk pussies, buggers, queens, fairies, dopers, junkies. Sick, venal. Someday a real rain will come and wash all this scum off the streets.
Okay, let's cut right there. What image do you get of the Vietnam vet from this film? What kind of portrayal is being offered? Is this a celebration of the Vietnam vet? Is it giving the Vietnam veteran hero status, or is there something else going on? What do you think?
Well, he's very bitter, and he seems somewhat antisocial. He's kind of rejected society.
No, exactly. And what lessons are we supposed to draw from this, do you think? What should we think of this man? Should we honor him, or should we fear him? Okay, now we're going to look at a film from 2 years later called Coming Home, 1978, in which Jon Voight plays a Vietnam vet, this time as a bitter paraplegic. But it also portrays the Vietnam vet in a more positive light later in the film, as a healer. His anger is clearly rooted, as you will see in this scene, in the fact that Americans failed to recognize the sacrifice that he had made on their behalf, that other Americans refused to recognize his plight. If we could see this clip from Coming Home. Jon Voight, Jane Fonda.
Oh, wait, God damn it!
Oh my God!
Would you please give me my canes, please?
I'm sorry.
Interns and orderlies! Fucking nurses and fucking... You treat us like nobody in your fucking hospital! God damn it, where are you people? Give it hell, dude. Kareem, you
So we can cut it right there. Why is he so bitter? Why is this man so angry? Is this the same kind of depiction as the depiction of Travis Bickle, or is there something different to it? What do you think?
Well, see, he seems to have perhaps maybe a better excuse to be a little bit bitter. He's lost the use of his legs, and you can, and when people go through a major change like that, you can understand a temporary, people getting upset and having trouble adjusting. still basically kind of scared.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting depiction. And we're going to see a little later in our class the rehabilitation of the Vietnam vet when we get to, of course, the famous John Rambo. But before we do that, I want to talk a bit in broader terms about what I'm going to call POV, or point of view. POV is a very important concept in filmmaking, and it's also a very important concept in real life, because a key issue is that what you see depends on your vantage point and perspective. And let's talk a bit about the Vietnam War and Vietnam War movies in terms of point of view. In films, a POV shot records a scene as it would be seen through the eyes of the actors themselves. Where the director chooses to place the camera determines how the story is told. So we're going to talk about a Vietnamese village, March 16th, 1968, and what happened there from different points of view. When the artillery shells begin falling early on that Saturday morning, any camera angle would seem to be arbitrary. But for a moment, let's consider the alternatives. Point of view, 500 feet in the air. 9 large Army assault helicopters sweep over the countryside. At 7:30 in the morning, the sun is already gleaming. Inside, men from Charlie Company sit nervously. They are launching a surprise attack on the Viet Cong's crack 48th Battalion, said to be holed up in that village down below. The men expect heavy resistance. They carry twice the normal load of rifle, machine gun ammunition. They're also loaded with grenades. As the choppers descend, their blades change pitch for the landing, making a sharp, cracking pop, pop, pop. It sounds almost like rifle fire. The nervous door gunners spray the surrounding field with rockets and machine gun fire. Now, the last few moments before a helicopter lands are the moments when a helicopter is most vulnerable. With no troops on the ground and the choppers settling down like clumsy ducks, the men are easily prey to ambush. So it's easy to imagine how these men might feel, right? Anxious, nervous, petrified by fear. Scrambling, the soldiers drop into the paddy and fan out. They secure the landing zone. Okay, that's one point of view. Let's go up 500 more feet to 1,000 feet up. There, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker hovers in a smaller chopper. Charlie Company is part of his task force, assembled to root out the Viet Cong, the pro-North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, in the area. Barker watches the operation from 1,000 feet up. After about 20 minutes, he sees a second wave of helicopters flying in below. Charlie Company regroups and heads into the hamlet, where the vegetation is denser. At 1,000 feet in the air, it's harder to figure out what's exactly going on the ground. But there's smoke, and there's the sound of small arms fire. So you know something's going on, but you can't quite make out what it is. At 8:28, Barker radios Captain Ernest Medina, the commander on the ground. Have you had any contacts down there yet? Medina replies that they have killed 84 Viet Cong. Barker's chopper then heads for home for the unit's operation center. Next point of view. Let's go up another 1,000 feet. The air corridor at 2,000 feet is reserved for the Americal Division's commander, who flies over the hamlet several times that morning, well out of reach of ground fire. At 2,500 feet up, the operations commander also monitors the situation. So as you rise higher, you get a very different point of view. You get an increasingly wider view of the terrain. But as you rise up, you also become more remote from what is occurring on the ground. So ironically, you see more and you see less. Now, the report of that morning's action quickly becomes distorted, not only because of height, but because of distance. The totals have now risen. A final count of 128 enemy killed, 13 suspects detained, 3 weapons captured. Anything sound odd about that? Anything sound odd about those figures?
As was often the case in Vietnam, they weren't very heavily armed people, apparently, if there were 128 and they only got, what, 3 weapons?
3 weapons. No, isn't that odd? Wouldn't that begin to make you a little suspicious that something may have happened that's not being conveyed? The body count is actually the largest recorded for any operation in the past 2 months, but only 3 weapons were captured. Could the Viet Cong retreat so rapidly that they could gather up all of their comrades' arms? Unlikely. Something is fishy. Now, based on this briefing, the New York Times carried a story, and that story said the following. About 150 men of the Americal Division encountered the enemy force early yesterday. The operation is another American offensive to clear enemy pockets still threatening South Vietnamese cities. Now, none of these dispatches hint that the events that took place that morning would tear the United States apart. There's not a clue that one of the most important events of the entire Vietnam War had just occurred. And it wasn't even clear to the people at 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet hovering above the action. Now, that during the same months that Charlie Company was conducting its search and destroy operations, Warner Brothers was completing final work on a movie about Vietnam called The Green Berets. It would be Hollywood's first dramatization of the Vietnam War, and it would be the only movie made about Vietnam while Americans were still involved. The film's star was, of course, John Wayne, and he had made his career playing heroes. For over 30 years, the Duke had been featured in such westerns as Stagecoach, Fort Apache, and the Alamo. He had assaulted enemy-held islands in World War II dramas like The Sands of Iwo Jima, Back to Bataan, and they were expendable. In the midst of this new war, John Wayne watched with dismay the growing protest against American involvement in Vietnam. And he decided that the time had come to fight back. He decided to star in a combat epic to show why Americans were at war in Vietnam. But the turbulent events of 1968 would make patriotism a hard sell, even for an old hand like John Wayne. In January, the Viet Cong had launched a series of surprise attacks. It's called the Tet Offensive. The strength of the Tet Offensive shocked Americans. For a little while, the Viet Cong actually seized control of the American embassy in Saigon. Unbelievable. Americans had been hearing rosy reports about the progress of the war, and the Tet Offensive shattered those positive reports. By the end of March, the war had so divided the United States that Lyndon Johnson had decided not to run for re-election as president. Events at home made this an increasingly chaotic, increasingly violent period. In April, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then in June, Robert Kennedy was gunned down. Both Kennedy and King were outspoken opponents of the Vietnam War. So Warner Brothers was a bit edgy about this new movie that it was making. Newspaper ads touting the Green Berets were almost offensive. "So you don't believe in glory," the ad said, "and heroes are out of style. And they don't blow bugles anymore. So take another look at the special forces in a special kind of hell." A very different kind of ad for a war movie than you had seen in the 50s or 40s. Anti-war protesters would picket the film's premiere. John Wayne profits off of GI's blood, read one sign. But an eager audience cheered as their hero, now 61 years old, led his Green Berets to a newly erected outpost in the heart of Viet Cong territory. At the end of more than 2 hours of action, U.S. Special Forces had tangled with mortar fire, nighttime raids, and poison punji sticks, emerging triumphant in their embattled outpost. Now, critics found the Green Berets very easy to dismiss. The New Yorker said the film was best handled with a pair of tongs. But enough of John Wayne's fans rallied around it to make it a solid financial success. Now, over the next quarter century, another 25 Vietnam War movies would be made. And I can assure you that you know a lot more about the Vietnam War from Hollywood than you do from scholarly books on the subject. So what we're going to do is take a look at those Vietnam War movies, and we're going to see what they teach us. What we're really going to see is how Hollywood made the Vietnam War, the most traumatic event in American history, how Hollywood made Vietnam palatable for the American people. And we're going to see that Hollywood didn't do it in just one way. Hollywood adopted multiple strategies that worked with different audiences. So what we're going to do first is take a look at these movies and see how they work. See how they appeal to certain basic myths, basic fantasies that Americans hold dear. Okay? So we're going to subject these films to historical lie detector tests, and we're going to see what they have to tell us. Now, the historical reality presented by a film is radically different than the historical reality portrayed by a letter or by a diary. At their best, films have a visual and emotional immediacy more vivid than anything one can write on a printed page. For Vietnam, they confront viewers with the feel of the war. Now, for a historian, objective truth, faith to the historical record is the most important goal. But for movie makers, there's a deeper goal. There are other principles more important. Does the screenplay move along quick enough? Do the characters develop sufficiently? Does the plot have enough suspense? Directors and screenwriters always have to tinker with the plot to make sure that it will connect with the audience. And so we're going to see how directors and screenwriters were able to connect viewers with the trauma of Vietnam. Now let's take an example before we go on, and that is Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July, a 1989 film. It was a film based on the memoir of a Vietnam vet, Ron Kovic, who was paralyzed in the Vietnam War and who became active in the anti-war movement. Kovic's faith in the war had been shaken by two dramatic events: a nighttime firefight in which he accidentally killed one of his own men, and then another night patrol in which his unit killed and wounded Vietnamese women and children. According to Kovic's book, these two events took place several months apart, but the film combines them into one episode. Similarly, Kovic describes a trip to an anti-war rally in Washington, D.C. In the film, he attends a protest at Syracuse University instead, where his high school sweetheart goes to college. In fact, Syracuse had no violent anti-war demonstrations, and Kovic's book makes no mention of a high school sweetheart. So what should we make of this? Does this disqualify the movie as history? What do you think?
I think it's interesting. Oliver Stone is doing the same thing. In another class, we're covering how Shakespeare mangled Plutarch's accounts of Julius Caesar and Coriolanus. The same thing, merging battles, adding girlfriends, and that sort of thing. I wouldn't read a film or a dramatic play as history in the first place, but...
Interesting. By deliberately changing the historical record, Stone has, of course, done what no historian would do. No doubt, he would defend this on dramatic grounds. Consider the crassly commercial grounds. For example, you give Kovic a girlfriend, and then you have the elements of romance in the movie, and that draws people in. But for dramatic reasons, too, the idea makes sense. Young, innocent Kovic goes off to Vietnam, a patriotic Marine, while his sweetheart goes off to college and becomes an anti-war demonstrator. Now, Kovic's struggle to come to terms with the war is intertwined with his search for a romantic relationship. Similarly, it makes dramatic sense to distill Kovic's traumatic war experiences into one vivid sequence. That leaves you more time to focus on his involvement with the anti-war movement. As for the decision to move the demonstration to Syracuse University, that makes sense for economic reasons. It's cheaper to stage a demonstration on a college campus than it is in Washington, D.C. Recreating a full-scale march with 500,000 people was beyond even the abilities of Oliver Stone to finance. But Stone could argue that he had remained faithful to the essence of the story, even if he had changed the facts. Because if the goal of the film was to show the painful road from patriotic innocence to disillusionment, and then the new commitment to political change, then the details don't really matter. This is a dramatic film. It is not a scholarly monograph. Now, like novels or plays, films strive for an artistic standard of truth. Artistic truth lies less in the accuracy of historical details than that the people act in authentically human ways. But the point remains, no matter how true a film tries to be to the emotions of its characters, the filmmakers always place dramatic concerns above strict truth to the historical record. So Hollywood is always pushed by its desire for profits to give audiences what they want. Okay? And that isn't hypocrisy. That isn't just crass commerciality. That is the reality of the movie marketplace. Dramatic films about history do not portray what actually happened. What they generally do is they portray what the filmmaker believes ought to have happened. In other words, what dramatic films do is they create myths. Now, we've talked about myths before in our class, particularly when we were talking about Westerns, and we told you then that a myth is a story that appeals to people's consciousness by giving expression to deep emotions. Most often, we think of myths in connection with traditional societies, with pre-literate societies. But our society also has myths, and it's filmmakers that manufacture our most influential myths. Hollywood creates stories and themes that are designed to give voice to our deepest psychological and emotional needs. So let's take a look at the John Wayne film, The Green Berets, and see how it plays with deeply rooted American myths. Now, anyone who's ever seen John Wayne movies knows that John Wayne embodies, John Wayne personifies two American mythic traditions. Mythic tradition number one, the Western. The central tale of the Western is the saga of white settlers crossing the prairie to subdue the wilderness, to replace wilderness with civilization. Wayne sometimes played the cowpoke, sometimes he played the dashing cavalry officer, but he embodied the Western. He was strong, independent, honest, and fair. Equality and liberty were the watchwords of the West. For John Wayne, the hero of the Western, was only a short step to the John Wayne of the Green Berets in Vietnam. What would be the similarity? How could you move the Western from the West to Vietnam? What do you think? How do you do this? What do you think?
He just plays the same character in different circumstances. He's still, like you said, liberty and equality and straight shooting, honesty and all that. You know, he takes that with him just into a new...
And bringing order to a savage environment, right? So it's the same theme. Instead of hunting Indians who menaced defenseless settlers, the Duke would now chase Asian guerrillas who lurked in the jungle. Rather than commanding a fort in Apache country, he would defend an outpost near the Laotian border that he called Dodge City. In other words, you can't miss the parallels because John Wayne is self-consciously constructing those parallels. You can't miss them. Once again, the heroes of the West would have a chance to uproot the corruptions of the past. This time, they're going to uproot the infection of communism spreading across Asia. But there is another mythic tradition that John Wayne personally embodied, and that is the combat epic of World War II. In World War II melodramas, you'll recall, an ethnically mixed assortment of recruits is thrown together, and each soldier is tested in the heat of battle. As the platoon shares the agonies and triumphs of experience, they are forged into a dedicated fighting unit. In other words, the combat epic retells the classic American tale of the melting pot. Immigrants from a multitude of backgrounds learn to live together as a single nation. So the platoon unites to win victory, and it embodies the ideals that set America apart from all other nations. Now, it was John Wayne, as much as anyone, who helped to shape those combat epics and make them stick in people's guts. In films like The Sands of Iwo Jima, these films work because they reinforce America's self-image. Now, in making the Green Berets, John Wayne was quite well aware of what he was doing. In late 1965, knowing he would need Army cooperation, he wrote to President Lyndon Johnson and made a successful pitch for this picture. Quote, "Someday soon a motion picture will be made about Vietnam. Let's make sure it's the kind of motion picture that will help our cause throughout the world. We want to tell the story of our fighting men in Vietnam with reason, emotion, characterization, and action. We want to do it in a manner that inspires a patriotic attitude on the part of our fellow Americans." Wayne knew that he was just the person to make this film. 37 years a star, he wrote, "I must have some small spot in more than a few million people's lives." How right he was. So let's take a look at how the Green Berets establishes its myths. Movies are a visual medium, and we should examine the images conjured up in this film. Wayne plays Colonel Mike Kirby, tanned, tall, an officer. He hates the bureaucratic hassles of high rank. He joins his men in the field. His foil is George Beckworth, a liberal newspaper columnist who attacks American involvement in Vietnam. He's a nervous chain smoker who won't look anyone in the eye. We're all familiar with this character from countless westerns. At Dodge City, Colonel Kirby meets his South Vietnamese ally, Captain Nim. He's able but bloodthirsty. He has personally greased 52 Viet Cong that year, and Nim hopes to double that number. He keeps score on the walls of his hut. Like all the Vietnamese characters in the film, he speaks a pidgin English. The journalist finds Captain Nim slapping around a captured Viet Cong spy. When the journalist demands an explanation, Kirby reveals that the spy has killed an American medic on a mission of mercy. The doctor was found in the jungle beheaded and mutilated. Now, such contrasts of brutality and innocence defiled are the central stuff of John Wayne's mythical Vietnam. While the Green Berets provide villagers with humanitarian aid, the Viet Cong rape young girls and torture wives in front of their husbands. To provide viewers with a visual reminder of the war's horrors, the fort is also furnished with Vietnamese orphans whose parents have been killed in a Viet Cong raid. The orphan is followed along by a little puppy, apparently because the filmmakers felt that an Asian orphan alone would not be enough to melt the hearts of the audience. And of course, in the climactic scene, the Viet Cong commit the ultimate atrocity when they murder the poor dog. Now, as so always happens in Hollywood films, questions of drama are supreme, and geopolitics is always reduced to personal relationships. The can-do American colonel, the stalwart South Vietnamese ally, the hapless orphan, all these are the mythic characters that make up the film, the Green Berets. So what we have is a war much like World War II, in which decent Americans must prevail against an unscrupulous, violent enemy. The message of the film is clear. Americans have come to Vietnam to defend democracy, to protect innocence, just as they have in every previous Hollywood war. Now, let's take a look at how the film is constructed dramatically. Let's see how John Wayne gets this film to connect with his viewers. Why does he put certain things in at certain points in the screenplay and not at others? In movies, characters are killed off because screenwriters want them to die. So let's take a look at why things happen when they do in this particular film. The plot of the Green Berets is odd, and it doesn't fit together very well. Most of the film focuses on Colonel Kirby's defense of his border outpost, but tacked onto this tale is a second story. As he prepares the defenses of Dodge City, Wayne is suddenly flown from his outpost to attend a dinner at a fancy night spot in Da Nang. There he sees an Asian beauty with a Vietnamese companion. Before we can learn more, a couple of Green Berets appear and yank Wayne from his dinner. The Vietnamese attack has begun. Only after Dodge City is safely retaken do we discover that the mysterious lady in Da Nang was a double agent, ready to lure the Viet Cong's highest-ranking general into a trap. The film then embarks on a subplot in which Wayne infiltrates a commando team armed with drug-tipped arrows and crossbows deep in enemy territory. Why arrows? Why crossbows? Again, you see the echoes of earlier John Wayne films. Sneaking into the general's bedroom, the Green Berets drug him and pack him off in a body bag to a rendezvous where he is lofted on high by a helium balloon and whisked away by an American airplane dragging a hook. Now, if it sounds unbelievable, wait till you see it in the movie, because it is unbelievable and it seems to have no real connection to the film itself. Even worse, it makes the film drag on interminably. So why did they add this silly subplot? What would be the appeal of this? Any Hollywood script doctor would have told you the way to shorten this too-long film was to cut out this subplot, which is easy enough to do, cutting and pasting. But if the producers considered this option, they didn't do it. So let's try to figure out why. Try eliminating the second plot and walk through what becomes the final scene of a shorter epic. Everything remains as before. See how the new ending plays. The Green Berets stand victorious outside Dodge City, thanks to an air attack which has strafed and killed nearly every Viet Cong in the fort. And so what is the ending? What conclusions would you draw from that ending? Of victory. Would victory be a very compelling message in a Vietnam War film in 1968? The Viet Cong flag fluttering over the outpost is cut loose and blows away. Wayne surveys the outpost. One of his sergeants walks up, says, "What do we do now, sir?" And Wayne replies, "First we get some sack time, and then we start all over again." Is that an inspiring conclusion to a John Wayne movie? All the tragic bloodshed, all the anguished deaths, all the carnage, so we can start all over again. That sounds more like an anti-war movie than a pro-war movie.
Would have been a good setup for a sequel,
though. When the flag goes up on Iwo Jima, it stays up. But in 1968, the course of the fighting is quite different. American armed forces did not try to capture territory. Instead, they attempted to kill as many as the enemy as possible. It was a war of attrition. When Americans engaged in search and destroy expeditions, they would move into an area and then they would return home, leaving the territory once again to the enemy. The problem in Vietnam is the victories never stayed won. And now I guess it's clearer why that silly second plot is there. In 1968, there was no prospects for an American military victory in Vietnam. But an action film demands a climax that will satisfy the audiences, that the hardships and deaths have not been in vain. And the only way that Wayne's screenwriters could devise that kind of satisfying ending was to devise a second, wholly implausible victory. So let's go back to point of view. The realities of the Vietnam War were becoming harder and harder to evade. John Wayne's film demonstrates that although myths might distort history, you could not ignore reality entirely. The tension between what should have been and what was made the Green Berets a very unsatisfying film. Because how come, if we won all the battles, we were losing the war? Already by the summer of 1968, an event in Vietnam was beginning to undermine the myths in which John Wayne had tried to cloak American involvement in Vietnam. Several days after Charlie Company returned from Son My in March 1968, a helicopter flew low over the area. And a gunner in that chopper named Ronald Ridenour was struck by the desolation. There was nobody around. When Ridenour spotted a body, it turned out not to be a Viet Cong soldier, but a dead woman spread-eagled on the ground. As the chopper continued to sweep, the pilot said, quote, "These people around here have had a pretty rough time the last few days." But he didn't elaborate. At first, Ridenour let this incident slip through his mind. Then a friend mentioned Charlie's company's operation. According to rumor, Charlie Company had killed an entire South Vietnamese village. When Ridenour returned to the United States, he could not let the matter rest. In March 1969, he summarized what he had learned in a letter and sent copies of the letter to the White House, to the Pentagon, to the State Department, and to members of Congress. The Army began an inquiry, and 75 witnesses were interviewed. The investigators' attention increasingly centered on the leader of the 1st Platoon, 2nd Lieutenant William Calley. On September 5th, 1969, the Army charged Lieutenant Calley with the premeditated murder of 109 Oriental human beings whose names and sexes are unknown by means of shooting them with a rifle. But interestingly, newspapers did not pick up this story, at least not until a journalist named Seymour Hersh became interested. He interviewed Charlie Company veterans, and one agreed to tell his story on CBS News. Both Time and Newsweek then ran cover stories. The accounts referred to the hamlet within the boundaries of Son My as My Lai. Point of view, the ground, at the edge of My Lai. Americans enter the hamlet nervously. They expect fire at any minute. They expect the concussion of a booby trap. A sergeant sees a man near a well. The man waves his arms, and then he's shot. The platoons begin pulling people out of their red brick houses. Point of view, below ground, a bunker. A Vietnamese civilian hears the artillery stop. He pokes his head out of the bunker and sees several American soldiers. He, his wife, children crawl out. He calls out a few words of English. Hello, okay. The soldiers order the 5 to walk to a canal ditch just outside the hamlet. Point of view, the infantry. There is a noise behind them. One of the men whirls and fires. It turns out only to be a water buffalo. Suddenly, the entire group begins firing. Soldiers begin dynamiting the brick houses and setting fire to the thatched huts. At the center of the hamlet, 45 Vietnamese are herded together. Lieutenant Calley says, quote, "I want them dead." He steps back 15 feet and begins shooting. Some infantry surround a group of women, children, and a teenage girl. Two of the soldiers pull back the top of the girl's black pajamas, traditional Vietnamese peasant garb. An old woman throws herself on the men, trying to protect the girl. The men punch and kick her aside. An M60 machine gun is fired. The women and children collapse on the ground. The family wait nervously at the top of the canal ditch. By now, 100 villagers have been herded together. Lieutenant Calley orders some of his men to push all these people into the ditch. Calley begins shooting, and the other soldiers fire as well. By 11 in the morning, the guns have fallen quiet. After lunch, Charlie Company blows up a few underground tunnels, demolishes the remaining houses, and moves out of My Lai. It was the wrong My Lai. Army maps listed 6 different hamlets named My Lai. A friendly Vietnamese informant had told Army intelligence that the Viet Cong's 48th Battalion was based at My Lai, but it was a different My Lai. Disaster had occurred. By the time the facts about My Lai became known, the wider debate over the war had thrown Lyndon Johnson out of the presidency. Richard Nixon began a lurching 4-year course of scaling back the conflict. Anti-war protests flared when Nixon sent American troops into neighboring Cambodia, but they tapered off again as the president carried out a policy he called Vietnamization, steadily withdrawing American troops and leaving South Vietnamese to absorb the brunt of the fighting. By 1973, American and North Vietnamese negotiators had hammered out a peace treaty that allowed Richard Nixon to claim peace with honor, but it was clear that this was largely a face-saving gesture. Despite all the pretenses, the war was a defeat for the United States. No one was surprised when just 2 years later, the North Vietnamese conquered South Vietnam and changed the name of Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City. As the war wound down by fits and starts, so too did the controversy over My Lai. The details of what happened at My Lai were so repellent, so offensive, that Americans didn't want to accept it as true. Nearly half of all Americans surveyed believed that reports of My Lai were a fabrication. They couldn't believe that American soldiers, no matter what the provocation, would engage in acts of mass murder. Supporters of the war pointed out that only months before, the communist forces had massacred thousands of civilians in the Vietnamese city of Hue. They portrayed My Lai as an aberration in American policy, the actions of a pitiful few psychotics. And war records reveal no other mass executions of similar magnitude. But there is testimony that civilians or suspected Viet Cong were treated harshly, shot indiscriminately, or tortured to extract information. How many of these incidents were unreported, we simply do not know. But for the public, My Lai became the defining moment of the war. It left shaken the long-cherished myth that Americans are different. We do not behave like other inhabitants of this corrupt world. We do not rape young girls. We do not execute innocent civilians. John Wayne had reduced complex political and economic issues to visual, intensely personal images. But the photographs from My Lai would shatter the mythic stereotypes of the Green Berets. So long as Americans fought in Vietnam, it was impossible to make a movie about the subject. For a decade, Hollywood evaded the Vietnam War in every way that it could. Hollywood approached the war only indirectly. For example, in a movie like MASH, which was set during the Korean War, but is really about the Vietnam War. But by 1978, attitudes were beginning to change, and a new wave of Vietnam films was scheduled for release. And the first one to appear was The Deer Hunter of 1978. Now, if you see the movie The Deer Hunter, it looks to be far less stereotyped than the Green Berets. The dialogue is more natural. The plot is less stilted. But this movie is just as mythic as is the Green Berets. The first third of the drama takes place in a steel town in the Allegheny Mountains. Michael, Nick, and Stephen are leaving their mill jobs in this Russian-American community to serve in Vietnam. Stephen is married after his last day at work. Then he and his buddies head into the mountains for one last deer hunt together. One must shoot a deer right. You must bring the buck down with only one shot. Now, is this authentic? Of course not. Clarenton is an imaginary town. The hunting scenes were not shot in the Alleghenies. They were shot on the other side of the continent, in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. When the deer proved to be too small, they airlifted larger deer from a game preserve in New Jersey. Then, in a flash, we are in Vietnam. After a firefight, the scene shifts abruptly to a Viet Cong camp where Stephen, Nick, and Michael are being held with other prisoners. Okay, let's see a brief glimpse from The Deer Hunter. Very famous scene.
Không. Không. Now we got ourselves a game. You and me. Im. Nó chân nó. Mấy ngàn. Mấy ngàn. Cầm súng mau. Rồi nha. Mau. Em đã. Em.
Okay, let's cut right there. What impression do you come away with having seen that scene? What images does that scene transmit to you about the Vietnam War? Okay, you have sadistic guards, right, guarding the American prisoners. They're forced to participate in a game of Russian roulette in which the prisoner must place a loaded pistol against his temple and fire. And Michael one-ups his tormentors by daring to play the game not with one bullet, but with 3 bullets in the chambers. Very remarkable. Now, is this an accurate glimpse of the Vietnam War?
I read an awful lot about the Vietnam War. I don't seem to recall very many cases of Russian roulette and what's about to happen.
But did you ever see any scenes or pictures or images that look just like that image? Not in the movies. Does that scene look at all familiar to you from any pictures you've ever seen of the Vietnam War?
Well, there's a famous scene
Press your button, please.
the famous scene of Colonel Lone shooting the Vietnamese prisoner.
Okay. I think that's exactly right. And I think that's exactly the scene that's being appealed to here. Now, in the film, when he wins, he uses the 2 remaining bullets to kill his guards and escape. The 3 men manage to reach American lines, but Stephen loses both legs, while Nick, his sanity shaken, disappears into the underworld of Saigon. The film's final third follows Michael back to Clarenton. Finally, he returns to Vietnam in a last attempt to rescue Nick, now a dazed, drug-addicted professional on the roulette circuit. Nick shoots himself, and back in Clarenton, his friends gather after the funeral and sing "God Bless America." Now, as was mentioned, there were no reports during the war of the Viet Cong forcing American prisoners to play Russian roulette. But if the deer hunter is not authentic in historical detail, does it reflect some kind of emotional truth about the war? The deer hunter's even longer than the Green Berets, 3 hours, 4 minutes to be exact. Yet how much of it concerns the actual experience of American GIs in Vietnam? Less than 4 minutes. Remarkable. Clearly, the director intended the audiences to come away believing they had experienced the war's agonies, the trauma of shattered communities, shattered friendships, shattered lives. But in suggesting how the trauma came about, the film's plot amounts to a comforting, even racist fantasy. Filmgoers who did not want to feel guilty could leave the theater singing "God Bless America." There was one documented case of roulette in Vietnam. The day after My Lai, an American captain took his .38 caliber revolver, placed it at the temple of a VC suspect, and spun the barrel. When the villager still refused to talk, the captain threw him against a tree, fired shots closer and closer to the man's head, and then aimed straight at him. The suspect broke down and began babbling. The anguished experience of Vietnam made it impossible for the deer hunter to follow the older, patriotic myths of the Western or combat film of World War II. It won acclaim because it acknowledged the pain of Vietnam, but it refused to come to grips with the actual circumstances of the war. Let's take a break.